So kind of getting your own house in order, if you will, or getting that alignment and those relationships, in place internally, is obviously a critical prerequisite or requirement. But then, once you move outside the four walls, you have, relationships that you have to establish, grow, manage with, shippers and carriers and 3PLs and other, trading partners. I mean, why do these relationships matter, outside the four walls? And what are the main barriers to building, strong, shipper, carrier, 3PL relationships? And how do you overcome those barriers?
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I was in a business review about a month ago, and it was really eye-opening because the shipper was taking a very commoditized approach towards our services, specifically logistics services, North American surface transportation at that point in time. And part of that was through kind of new ownership and perhaps, getting themselves set up for various different, financial opportunities on their end on a go-forward basis. But the point being is they came into the conversation and it was really clear out of the gate that it was one-sided, specifically them to us. And while, it is what it is, and you kind of react to that sort of environment, I still found it very interesting because when they started to work through their metrics specific to capacity, route guide erosion, service, they started to see things building in a negative way or away from what they wanted. And they couldn't quite really put their finger on why that was happening. And one of the things I in a professional and polite way kind of pointed back to them is that their forecasting isn't available. And when it's available, it's really wrong. It's never really within that majority percentage basis as just a starting point, let alone 70, 80, 90% accurate. And beyond that, when you started really digging into their service metrics, the way that they were defining them and the way that they were reporting out was not only highly variable and inconsistent, but when they actually started to dig into them within their own business review, they pretty much dismissed them. And so when you think about an environment where they're heavily oriented on price, they're not necessarily giving you forecast information or requirements around their variability or what they're going to expect. And then beyond that, supplement them with unfavorable or potentially one-sided metrics, you get yourself into an environment on their side where you could start to see the stress and the anxiety as they built into their seasonal peak, because the fact of the matter is they didn't know what they could trust and they didn't know what they had. And when you start thinking about just-in-time environments, visibility to those just-in-time shipments, and then the importance of in-transit inventories and services associated to, and service levels associated to getting things there on or around the approximate need date, and then the relationships associated to all of that planning, it's more so emblematic of the conversation we just finished in terms of synchronizing all these different streams on their side. I would say treating these providers and looking at providers as an extension of that internal synchronization and alignment is just as important. Naturally, you need that internal synchronization and alignment to be able to understand the narrative externally. But if you stop at your four walls and don't extend that externally, you really open yourself up to an environment where your providers don't understand your strategy, they don't understand your need. And if then you're starting to compound that problem by strictly sorting and driving down price as best as you possibly can. And again, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but when you do that and are really myopically focused on just that, you miss out on this opportunity of forecast sharing, capacity planning, need planning, and then above and beyond that, variable planning. And so, from my perspective, if you're not looking at these core relationships, and I probably should clarify, I recognize that if you have 100 logistics service providers, that you can't have these types of relationships with all of them, that some provide a niche, some provide maybe seasonal capacity or peak capacity, some provide maybe backup type roles, and then others are core or strategic providers. And really understanding the fragmentation and the segmentation associated to how your company aligns to that, and then ultimately your practices associated to those buckets and how you enforce those buckets in a positive way is critical. Because you could have the best, most aligned strategies on the planet internally. If you don't translate that externally and really own that translation in the form of proactive measurements and problem resolution associated to various different things that could potentially pop up over and above forecasting and peak season planning, you're just really not translating it, and you're opening yourself up to a pretty big risk relative to how these networks align to you as a shipper. And everybody that's associated to this has seen how optimal that supply-demand measurement has been over the last several years. And if for whatever reason you're not allowing that optimization of asset to need to happen, you're really missing out on an opportunity to do a couple things. Number one, create repeatability, and number two, to trap and own that capacity that is basically being committed to you by these 3PLs and these logistics service providers.
Yeah, no, a lot of great food for thought there, and advice. I mean, I think, you're right. I mean, you can't have, strategic relationships with everybody, right? Because I mean, creating the type of relationships that we're talking about here, there is an investment of time, there's an investment of resources, energy, that's involved. So you have to be, selective in terms of, and identify who the right partners are to do this. And I think it's, one of the ways is really changing the mindset, right? Away from a provider, viewing someone as a provider, to viewing them as a partner, right? Yeah. And it may sound kind of, silly, or just a change of words, but it is truly a different mindset. I mean, one of the great quotes that I like, is from my friend Kate Vitasic, who wrote Vested Outsourcing and the whole vested approach to developing business relationships. And she wrote a post maybe a couple of years ago that advocated that instead of sending a request for proposal, an RFP, send out a request for partnership, right? Yeah. And what would that be, right? If you change the definition of an RFP to request for partnership, what would you look for, right? What would you look for in a partner, right? Versus a proposal. Right. And I think that's a good, question to think about, because I think that will lead you, to different, down a different path and a different approach to how you would work with these external parties.